Welcome to Crossroads. I'm your host, Joshua Philipp. We have a great guest with us today, Marc Ruskin. He was in the FBI for 27 years. He was an undercover agent. He is an adjunct professor at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He worked as an assistant DA. He's the author of this book, The Pretender, which talks about not just life in the FBI, but also explains the nature of the leadership, how things are done. And it's going to tie into what we're talking about today. But first, Marc, real pleasure having you on again.
Hey, great to be back.
Great to see you. Now, if you've been following some of the mainstream media, you might think Trump's going to be impeached. You might think everything's fallen apart. And if you've been reading some papers, I won't name them by name, you might even think the old deep state, which used to be a conspiracy theory, is actually just protecting America's interests. But Marc has another story to tell us. So Marc, I guess we'll start with the impeachment process right now. Now, we were discussing a bit before that if you really know the laws, it's almost a non-issue. But for a lot of people who don't know the laws or the real technical details of it, they might be concerned. So tell us, I guess, just to start, do you think the impeachment can actually happen? What are we watching happening right now?
Well, I think what we're watching with the impeachment procedure or process that you're talking about, you have to remember it's a process that started in 2016. It's not something which started a couple of weeks ago. The impulse for impeachment that has been coming particularly from the House of Representatives, but also from the media, or from the legacy media, is something that's been ongoing for a couple of years now. And arguably, each time that an attempt is made to initiate a vehicle or in order to try and impeach the president, it ends up falling on its face, not working out, being proven to be unsubstantiated, and then the same individuals move on to a new theory, totally different and distinct.
Which envelops the whole country every single time. It's the biggest story in the country, and then it disappears like a wisp of smoke, right?
Right, and I mean, there were announcements by House members in particular that they were looking to impeach the president before he was inaugurated. So it's not a new story. What's new, and it's not even new characters. What's new is the procedures which are being used. The disturbing thing is that the procedures become more and more absurd the more the procedure gets stretched out. After each successive failure, the proponents of impeachment, looking for a new vehicle, take it to a more and more absurd level. And the most recent attempt, ongoing now, to impeach the president, throws the rule book out the window, basically, in the desperation that the actors are demonstrating in their desire to impeach the president.
So tell us this, can they impeach Trump?
In order to impeach the president, you have to prove that there were high crimes and misdemeanors committed by the president. To date, no one has articulated facts which would substantiate a high crime or misdemeanor.
And based on what we're seeing now, it seems like they don't care about evidence, that they're going to vote regardless of evidence. If they vote regardless of evidence, can it happen still?
Well, first, what they've done is taken this underground. I mean, with the secret hearings, as open hearings didn't work out, then they moved to the secret hearings. As to whether it ultimately can succeed, the fact, regardless of how the House votes, the House does not conduct the impeachment trial itself. That would be in the Senate, and the Senate is still a Republican majority Senate. In the best of all possible worlds, everyone would be operating by standards and principles of justice, which are typically part of the way the justice system works, and both the House and the Senate would operate objectively. Now I think we can all agree that the House is not going to operate objectively. They're going to operate in a partisan political manner. Now in the Senate, if the Senate examines what is ultimately presented as evidence, we'll have to see what evidence there is. Giving the benefit of trying to be fair, giving the benefit of the doubt to the House for now, perhaps they will come up with evidence which we're not aware of, none of us are aware of at this time, which will shock and surprise us, and then the Senate will have to take it into consideration. To date, that hasn't happened. To date, there is no evidence of any crime or high crime or misdemeanor. But who can predict what the future has in store?
And so I think this brings us into the next issue, which, now if you remember a few years ago, if you said deep state, people would say, oh, that's conspiracy theory, that's crazy, that's just, it's just craziness. Don't pay attention to it. Now we have major media writing headlines like, along the lines of, the deep state is real and it's here to protect us from tyranny and these types of crazy things. So they've come out. Apparently there is a deep state, and apparently they don't like Trump. Do you think this ties into that? And I think we've seen recently some of the people who are coming out seem to be those types, at least based on the description. But I guess maybe we should step back and how would you describe the deep state?
Well, I think that it's worthwhile to start off by reviewing what is referred to as the deep state and what the history of it is and why it has come into being. And this was what I would propose. And I'll frame it by saying that initially I was as skeptical as anybody else when the term arose of deep state. I myself was thinking, well, this is a little bit of an exaggeration. It's a bit of a conspiracy theory. Maybe it's going a little too far, and I was hesitant to use the term because of associations that I thought it had of a conspiratorial nature. Now you're right. Now, lo and behold, it's come to be accepted as a mainstream reality. And what it is essentially is the equivalent of what in the United Kingdom is referred to as the Mandarins. It's the long-term career civil service. And what has happened over the past several decades or couple of generations is as the federal government has expanded in power, it's expanded in personnel and it's expanded in its regulatory powers, so that through a natural process of bureaucratic evolution, what was once simply a few disparate, distinct executive institutions, the Department of Justice, the Department of Education, the Department of Labor, they've mushroomed now by necessity, by the I would argue, absurd growth of laws, quantity of laws, and thus spawned a quantity of regulations, and people have to enforce these regulations and write the regulations. And so as the federal government has expanded in power and numbers, the authority of these long-term career civil servants has itself evolved. And that is, I would suggest, the functional start and explanation of what has developed into what we now call the deep state, which is essentially the entrenched long-term career bureaucracy. And the fact that they have established such a strong power over the last few decades, and like a snowball down the hill, it's going faster and faster, accounts for why they are able now to pose a threat to the president himself, to the White House, and to cabinet ministers, and even really to elected representatives, because those who are elected, the politicians, they come and go. They'll be, in the Senate, the House, they may be there for a long time, but they're still ultimately going to be going. And in the executive, of course, the turnover is much quicker. So the powers which are long-term entrenched have the security and the self-confidence, and now we're beginning to see, hopefully, the overconfidence to think that they can actually challenge the will of the people and its elected representatives. And thus you have individuals like Comey, the former director of the FBI, James Clapper, John Brennan, these high-level bureaucrats who essentially mock the democratic process, have contempt for it to the point that they've acted the way they have. And it looks like, thanks to the Attorney General Barr, and Durham, the U.S. Attorney, who's working in hand, that maybe now some of this power is going to be reined in.
Well, and we've seen this recently, just as an example of the kind of this deep state thinking, I guess we could call it. We had this individual come out, was it Vadim?
Right, the lieutenant colonel.
Yeah, comes out and says something along the lines that, well, President Trump is undermining foreign policy. The president sets foreign policy. That is the power of the president, not of these bureaucrats. I mean, how does this happen?
Well, again, it's part of the growth in the self-confidence of...
Yeah, to where they think they have more authority than the president, or they
right.
can overstep the given authority of the president, right?
And so that they think that they're invulnerable. And that hopefully will be shot down now with the upcoming report and from the reports and investigation being conducted on the criminal level by Durham.
Well, and that's important. Could you tell us a bit about that? What's in store? I mean, of course, we don't know the content, but we can kind of discuss the significance of it and I guess we can't speculate on what's going to come out too much, but I think the significance can't be understated.
Well, yeah, first, in terms of what you were saying about the president setting foreign policy, it seems like a lot of the individual actors have forgotten essentially what their roles are. I mean, their role is not, they may not see the big picture. For someone like this lieutenant colonel or some of the other people who have testified, and I would say testified in quotes, because they're not operating under a real judicial system with judicial protections and safeguards, being subordinates, they don't realize, they've forgotten that they may not see the whole big picture. It's the individual in charge who sees the big picture, and the actors are pawns. And it's the pawn, such as the lieutenant colonel, doesn't see the big picture and is a lot of presumption to be making pronouncements when there may be things going on. One thing that's good about this, perhaps, is that it brings out of the woodwork some of the individuals who have less scruples than others. As to your question about where the investigation is leading to, a strong argument can be made that it's leading now towards criminal prosecutions ultimately. If AG Barr and Durham traveled to Europe to conduct interviews and investigations, they wouldn't be traveling there if they didn't already have articulable facts, concrete evidence that there's been crimes committed. And this would give them the impetus to go now and conduct additional investigation in Europe. And when they're traveling in Europe, it's not just the two of them traveling on their own. I mean, they're traveling with teams of special agents, of FBI agents, teams of prosecutors and other personnel conducting the investigation. So the investigation would be conducted at high level, mid-level, low level simultaneously. And it's likely that there's going to be some interesting results, and ultimately some heads will roll, I suspect.
Well, and this ties into, I think, what you mentioned in your book as well. The nature of the deep state, your book doesn't mention it, of course, but the nature of the upper leadership, upper management, and kind of the guys on the ground. You mentioned, of course, that the FBI has this culture where a lot of the agents on the ground are usually people who really care about their work, really do good work. But a lot of the management has a very different culture. And I know we've talked about this before, but I think it's important in this context. Could you explain how that culture works?
Well, one thing I'll mention, and I'll say in respect to the book, is my book is the first insider's account of how decisions are made in the FBI, what goes on behind those opaque curtains. There have been journalists who have written from the outside, interviewing people, but this is the first account by an insider of what really goes on. And one of the things which I talk about here is how the FBI culture is different from any other institutional culture that I'm aware of, in that the hierarchy, the pyramid, every organization generally is a pyramid. Everyone starts at the lower level and tries to work their way up to the top. The FBI is the one pyramid where all the special agents start at the entry level and want to stay there. There are very few FBI agents who want to go into management. People become FBI agents because they want to protect society, and they want to investigate criminal activity or espionage. They want to be in the field conducting investigations, and what they seek normally as they progress in their careers is more and more complex investigations, more responsibility, and more interesting work, not to be divorced from the terrain and to be flying a desk, essentially. So the individuals who are attracted to management, not always, I mean, there are some outstanding and exceptional managers, but many, many, many are those who were not comfortable working in the field, who maybe were not good at developing rapport, and went into management. So what you have at the very top are the individuals who are more political types, people who are ambitious for power generally, and divorced often from what is actually happening in the street. And what it leads to in the long run is what we see happening in the past couple of years in the FBI is when the upper management, the director of the FBI, the deputy director, all these individuals who are denizens of what we call the 7th floor at JEH. The JEH is the Hoover Building, and that's FBI headquarters. And the 7th floor is the executive suite. That's where the director and these individuals work and live. And these are the ones who betrayed not only the public trust, but they betrayed the trust of the FBI agents who work under them and who work hard every day, and who are my comrades from my time in the Bureau. And I was a field agent, but I did spend some time in management, so I understand how it works. But I went into management as an aside, not because I wanted to gain power, I wanted to work overseas, and it was a stepping stone to an overseas assignment. So, and I did work, as you know, in South America and Europe for different periods of time.
Now let's talk about this concept of what they call fruit of the poisoned tree. Because I know that within the impeachment hearings, these closed hearings, the way it's being done in terms of how they even allow or disallow them to have legal representation.
Right.
I mean, first of all, explain to us what fruit of the poison tree is and whether you think this qualifies as that.
Well, the concept of fruit of the poisonous tree has to do with constitutional criminal law safeguards, which have been interpreted over the years by the Supreme Court, which bar the use as evidence of evidence which has been obtained either illegally or in violation of an individual's rights. So if the evidence has been obtained illegally, it is then considered fruit of the poisoned tree, of the poisonous tree, and that the fruit may be good, the evidence may be good, but it was obtained in an illegal or inappropriate manner, and thus cannot be used. And that applies in criminal proceedings. What we're seeing here, particularly in the past few weeks, is that the rule book, the constitutional safeguards, have been chucked out the window by the congressional leaders who are conducting the hearings. Having failed at impeaching the president by following more or less the rules, they've now decided to discard them. And I talk particularly with Representative Chairman Schiff, Adam Schiff, in that, first of all, he's the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. I don't understand, no one's articulated to me yet, why the Senate Intelligence Committee is conducting an impeachment hearing. What do they have to do with impeachment? I mean, normally it would be the Judiciary Committee, perhaps, the Oversight Committee, perhaps, could arguably have jurisdiction, but the Intelligence Committee, not at all. The only reason that they have jurisdiction is because Schiff has claimed jurisdiction. As to the procedures they're following, there's no procedure that allows for secret hearings. There's no procedure that allows for the chairman of a House committee to determine who can and who cannot testify at a hearing. They're writing the rules as they go along. Or I shouldn't say writing, they're inventing the rules as they go along. So it's important to keep in mind that the rules now are being written as they go along, or invented rather as they go along. And Schiff is inventing the rules. And there's no precedent for having a hearing, a secret hearing, unless it is dealing with classified materials. No one here is arguing that the so-called testimony is classified. So there's no justification, and it's important for those who oppose what the creation, the invention of these rules, have to stand up and not allow them to be utilized and accepted as a norm when they are and this is an important point, I would say. There are principles which have evolved over centuries of having to do with constitutional protections for individuals who are accused of whatever wrongdoing. And these principles are being chucked out the window, being disregarded by Chairman Schiff and the others who are working with him. And to disregard these principles undermines the fairness that these procedures have been designed to protect. And what many are forgetting is that if they can be used now to try and impeach Trump, next time they're going to be used to try and impeach someone that they like. And once the precedent has been set, it's going to be in place. It's going to be hard to undo it. Once the toothpaste is out of the tube, it's awful hard to get it back in.
And then at that point, what is the election of the president? If these elected officials or even unelected officials can decide for themselves, we don't like the guy that the people of this country elected, let's just get rid of him.
And one thing I'll point to, as far as which confirms what you just said, is to refer back to what the Representative Al Green of Texas said. It is important that the president, that Trump, be impeached, because if he's not impeached, then there's a very good chance he'll be reelected. So what does that say? What contempt does he and his ilk have for the democratic process when they're stating unashamedly that it's important to impeach the president because, God forbid, he not be impeached, the will of the people may be expressed and the president may be re-elected.
Well, and then, of course, some people have characterized the impeachment hearings as a coup. Trump calls it a witch hunt. And it really is kind of this extra legal process in some ways, going against the will of the people and really being done without any real evidence and being done in ways that really go against normal judicial process. Do you think it's accurate to call it a coup?
You could call it an attempted coup because it hasn't succeeded to date. It's certainly a ongoing concerted attempt to undermine the will of the American people as expressed in the elections and as may be expressed in the following elections. It's been interfering with substantive advances by the legislature in that nothing else gets done practically because all the energy of the House of Representatives is focused on this attempted coup, if you wish, to this attempt to unseat the president. The one perhaps positive note, if there is a silver lining in this cloud, would be that the Democrats, by focusing all their attention on trying to impeach the president, are unable to pass any other kind of substantive legislation. And so they are essentially blowing their golden opportunity to get something done. I mean, they have a majority now of the midterm elections. All of a sudden, the Democrats have a majority in the House. They could be using it to pass substantive legislation that would further their ideological goals. You know, perhaps we should rejoice in the fact that by spending all this time trying to impeach the president, they are ignoring their own political agenda and not passing laws which would be anathema to many Americans.
Which says something. It means that in terms of priorities, they regard it as more important to try to get rid of Trump. Why is that?
Well, I think to a certain extent, arguably, it's become an obsession for them. It's you know, them and some of the media live and breathe a desire to impeach Trump, and the more difficult it becomes, the more unattainable it becomes, the more obsessed they become with it, and consequently, they don't do anything to further their agenda other than occasionally speaking about what they'd like to do, but their progressive agenda, what has become essentially a fairly left-wing agenda, is not being furthered. And Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker, and all her followers have now wasted this opportunity to get some laws passed that would further what they claim to believe in. Now, if in the following elections they lose their majority, they will have lost their opportunity to pass, you know, more socialistic type of left-wing legislation, which the fact that they haven't been able to, I would suggest, is a good thing.
Well, I guess just last question. So, where are we at right now? They're using possibly things that would qualify as fruit of the poisonous tree if they do get the impeachment passed. They're running an impeachment which very likely cannot succeed because they don't have the Senate votes. And at the same time, the whole, you know, call it deep state or whatever, they're all showing their faces. I mean, what's going on in your understanding?
Well, at the end of the day, they will have done themselves, their constituents, and the American people a great disservice. On the positive note, as we just discussed, they haven't been able to further their legislative agenda, and depending on the results of the AG's investigations, a lot of heads may fall which would not have fallen but for what's been happening the past couple of years.
A lot of people have speculated that maybe that's why they're fighting back. Trump tweeted out, actually, that he said he promised to drain this, not the exact words, but he promised to drain the swamp, and the swamp is fighting back. It's kind of how he described this process. Do you think that's accurate? Well,
it's certainly putting up a good fight, and you know, when one sees John Brennan or James Clapper being interviewed, you know, they've been for months, maybe years now, making conclusory statements about the president, you know, accusing him of treason, accusing him of this or that, without ever articulating facts to support their conclusory statements. But now it seems that their comments are getting more and more hysterical. And it could be that they see that there's a shift now in the wind, and that their position is beginning to shift, and there's confidence in being invulnerable is beginning to evaporate as they see the prosecutors getting closer and closer.
Now, Marc, where can people find your book?
Well, at any place, you know, to use an old phrase where books are sold, but certainly at Amazon is a good start.
Great. Hey, real pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks again, Josh.
Good
Great
job.
to be here.
And everyone, please remember to like and subscribe. See you next time.